Hola, ¿cómo está? This is the Spanish version, but that's the only Spanish I know. So you probably heard that in an earlier video. Welcome. We're studying the Bible. We are in Genesis chapter 41 today. And 41 is such an important chapter. Um, it explains how Joseph got where he was. It explains how God used divine providence to get them out of Egypt. It explains how the 400 years of slavery started. It is such a pivotal book that understanding it in its context is really important to understanding Exodus and understanding really the last 8 chapters of Genesis. It'll make a lot more sense why a lot of the things happened if we understand that. So, Genesis chapter 41, I'm going to be reading from the New Living Translation, and here we go. 2 full years later. Now, remember, I know I said I was going to read and then I stopped again because that's just the way I am. But we had just finished chapter 40, and the cupbearer forgot about Joseph interpreting his dream. So that's where this starts. Remember, chapters and verses in the Bible were added much later. The story just kind of kept going. So that's important to remember too. So 2 full years later, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing on the bank of the Nile River. In his dream, he saw 7 fat, healthy cows come up out of the river and begin grazing in the marsh grass. Then he saw 7 more cows come up behind them from the Nile, but these were scrawny and thin. These cows stood beside the fat cows on the riverbank. Then the scrawny, thin cows ate the 7 healthy, fat cows. At this point in the dream, Pharaoh woke up, but he fell asleep again and had a second dream. This time he saw 7 heads of grain, plump and beautiful, growing on a single stalk. Then 7 more heads of grain appeared, but these were shriveled and withered by the east wind. East, remember that. And these thin heads swallowed up the 7 plump, well-formed heads. Then Pharaoh woke up again and realized it was a dream. The next morning, Pharaoh was very disturbed by the dream, so he called for his magicians and wise men of Egypt. Then Pharaoh told them his dreams. Not one of them could tell him what they meant. Finally, the king's chief cupbearer spoke up. Today I've been reminded of my failure. He told Pharaoh, some time ago you were angry with the chief baker and me, and you imprisoned us in the palace of the captain of the guard. One night the chief baker and I had a dream, and each dream had its own meaning. There was a young Hebrew man with us in the prison who was a slave of the captain of the guard. We told him our dreams, and he told us what each of our dreams meant, and everything happened just as he had predicted. I was restored to my position as cupbearer, and the chief baker was executed and impaled on a pole. Pharaoh sent up for Joseph at once, and he was quickly brought from the prison. After he shaved and changed his clothes, he went in and stood before Pharaoh. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream last night, and no one here can tell me what it means, but I've heard that you hear about a dream and you can interpret it. It is beyond my power to do this. This is important because he's establishing the fact he serves God, not the other way around. So, uh, so Pharaoh told Joseph his dream. I'm sorry. It is beyond my power to do this, Joseph replied, but God can tell you what it means and set you at ease. So Pharaoh told Joseph his dream. In my dream, he said, I was standing on the bank of the Nile River, and I saw 7 fat, healthy cows come up from the river and begin grazing in the marsh grass. So he goes and he tells this dream, and then he goes back to sleep. And in my dream, he says, I also saw 7 heads of grain, full and beautiful, growing on a single stalk. And basically what happened there. So Joseph responded, both of Pharaoh's dreams mean the same thing. God is telling Pharaoh in advance what he's about to do. The 7 healthy cows and 7 healthy heads of grain both represent 7 years of prosperity. The 7 thin, scrawny cows that came up later and the 7 thin heads of grain withered by the east wind represent 7 years of famine. This will happen just as I have described it, for God has revealed to Pharaoh in advance what he's about to do. The next 7 years will be a period of great prosperity throughout the land of Egypt. But afterward there will be 7 years of famine so great that all the prosperity will be forgotten in Egypt. Famine will destroy the land. This famine will be so severe that even the memory of the good years will be erased. As for having two similar dreams, it means that these events have been decreed by God and he will soon make them happen. Because repetitive dreams meant to them at the time that this was how God communicated it to them. So therefore, Pharaoh should find an intelligent and wise man and put him in charge of the entire land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh should appoint supervisors over the land and let them collect 1/5 of all the crops during the 7 good years. Have them gather all the food produced in the good years that are just ahead and bring it to Pharaoh's storehouses. Store it away and guard it so there will be food in the cities. That way there will be enough to eat when the 7 years of famine come to the land of Egypt. Otherwise, this famine will destroy the land. So Joseph's suggestions were well received by the Pharaoh and his officials. So Pharaoh asked his officials, can we find anyone else like this man, so obviously filled with the Spirit of God? It's not that they believed in Yahweh or necessarily even in Joseph. It's that they believed there were many gods, and this one was talking to a God. We're going to listen to him. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has revealed the meaning of the dreams to you, clearly no one else is as intelligent or wise as you are. You will be in charge of my court, and all my people will take orders from you. Only I, sitting on my throne, will have a rank higher than yours. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the entire land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh removed his signet ring from his hand and placed it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in fine linen clothing and hung a gold chain around his neck. Now remember, he was a slave just a couple hours ago. and the father, the main guy, is putting the next guy in charge. It's all a shadow of how God did it with Jesus. We'll see more of this. Then he had Joseph ride in the chariot reserved for his second in command. And wherever Joseph went, the command was shouting, kneel down. So Pharaoh put Joseph in charge of all Egypt. And Pharaoh said to him, I am Pharaoh, but no one will lift a hand or foot in the entire land of Egypt without your approval. So then Pharaoh gave Joseph a new Egyptian name, Zaphanat Paneah. He also gave him a wife whose name was Asenath. She was the daughter of Potiphar, the priest of On. So Joseph took charge of the entire land of Egypt. He was 30 years old and he began serving in the court of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. And when Joseph left Pharaoh's presence, he inspected the entire land of Egypt. As predicted, for 7 years, the land produced bumper crops. During those 7 years, Joseph gathered all the crops grown in Egypt and stored the grain in the surrounding fields in the cities. He piled up huge amounts of grain like sand on the seashore. Finally, he stopped keeping records because there was so much to measure. During this time, before the first of the famine years, 2 sons were born to Joseph and his wife Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, the priest of On. Joseph named his older son Manasseh, and he said, God has made me forget all my troubles and everyone in my father's family. Joseph named his second son Ephraim, for he said, God has made me fruitful in this land of my grief. At last, the 7 years of bumper crops throughout the land of Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began, just as Joseph had predicted. The famine also struck all the surrounding countries, but throughout Egypt there was plenty of food. Eventually, however, the famine spread throughout the land of Egypt as well, and when the people cried out to Pharaoh for food, he told them, go to Joseph and do whatever he tells you. So with severe famine everywhere, Joseph opened up the storehouses and distributed grain to the Egyptians. For the famine was severe throughout the land of Egypt, and people from all around came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph because the famine was severe throughout the world. It's a long chapter, 57 verses, I get that, but I'm glad you stuck with me because it's going to be worth it. There's so much in this chapter. Now, when Egypt was taken over by the Semites and were ruled by them, they didn't keep records of stuff like that. We talked about that a little bit last time, but private Egyptian citizens did. So there's this Egyptian historian called Manetho, and he had this to say, and I'm just going to read it because it's so well written. But It says, "We had a king called Ptolemaeus. In his reign it happened. I do not know why God was displeased with us. Unexpectedly, from the regions of the east came men of unknown race. Confident of victory, they marched against our land. By force they took it, easily without a single battle. Having overpowered our rulers, they burned our cities without compassion and destroyed the temples of the gods. All the natives were treated with great cruelty for this, for they slew some and carried off the wives and children of others into slavery. Finally, they appointed one of themselves as king." So this all happened prior to Joseph. This is why they put him in charge, because if they had been Egyptians in charge, they wouldn't have done that. They wouldn't have put a Hebrew in charge. But he was a Semite like they were, so they trusted him. So in God's divine providence, this set the stage for Joseph's position. And Israel was to be held hostage for over 4 centuries. Now, it's important to remember, too, only 2 of those centuries were they actually held in bondage and slavery. The other 2, they were actually treated pretty well. So 2 years have passed. Joseph's still in prison. You know, everybody, the cupbearer forgot about him. And the Pharaoh calls all his magicians, and wise men. These were really his governmental cabinet. Secretaries of the cabinet is kind of what we call them now in the U.S., but they represented really the spiritual and intellectual elite of Egypt. So Christians could learn from this commitment of the pagans. Even though it was a false religion, they considered it the center of their lives. Everything revolved around that. We don't really do that where everything is tied to our belief system. Christians, generally kind of have a lackluster kind of relationship with our spiritual life. But Joseph says these dreams are from God about a great famine, and it's another reminder that God doesn't bring judgment without warning, even to those that aren't his. He gives warning to that. So Joseph says 20% of all produce must be stored away 7 years in the future. Be wise, prepare for what's coming. Obviously, the people are not too thrilled with having to give up 20% of everything. They looked around and they said, "Hey, everything looks good. We're many just saw it as a way to confiscate food because they're like, hey, we're rich. We're living in abundance. Would we have the faith to do that? I don't know. It's very difficult to believe God when things are going really well, and He tells you things are about to change. The circumstances tell us differently. We don't want to believe sometimes. I give the Pharaoh a lot of credit for believing Joseph. That's important. Would we have the faith to hear a time of tribulation is coming and we need to prepare for it? Put aside some of our riches and our stuff, deprive ourselves. I don't know. Jehovah has told us that before Jesus returns, there will be a time so terrible that we can't comprehend it. That's coming. It's in the future. He has told us to prepare by giving our lives to Him, by following the wisdom of living within our means, getting out of debt, seeking Him, learning to rely on Him. He's telling us that right now. It's coming. So we need to take that to heart and do something with it. So this Hebrew slave's taken from the dungeon, shaved, put on new clothes, ceremonies held. He wanted all of Egypt to know his new position. He gave him that new name. That name, Zat En Fat, means he who is called. Panea means life. So his name means something who is called life. Basically, he's going to restore life to the country, to the people. Another shadow of Christ, maybe. See how this is going to play out. And a name is reputation, really. So to seal it, he gives him his ring, and he gives him one of his daughters, daughter of a priest, and gave him a wife and kids, kind of shore him up that way. So 6 years passed. It's 1 year before the famine, and he has 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. They were fully Egyptian because his wife was Egyptian. It would have been unthinkable, the daughter of a sun god's priest, a priest in Egypt, to become a Hebrew. So she would have still been very much pagan. Ephraim means fertile in the sense of abundant. And so Joseph viewed Egypt as a place of comfort. It wasn't a foreign land to him. He was happy there. Um, so he even refers to it as a replacement home. The famine hit and it's a widespread, and the whole Middle East was affected. So the grain was sold too. It was not given away. It wasn't charity. It was sold to them. And eventually people gave up money and cattle and land and their freedom. And that's how they got into slavery. So Pharaoh eventually owned all the land and all the wealth. It allowed him to build up a slave workforce, to construct the temples, roadways, and cities. As horrible as all this was, God used it to save lives because it assured the survival of Israel. So slavery's wrong, yes, but God can use even bad things to get his plan accomplished. So I wonder what the Egyptian people, though, thought of Joseph, because he wasn't one of them. He was an outsider. Did he get thanked? Probably not. He was probably just blamed and hated, especially as they got sold into slavery. They blamed him because Joseph was the front man. Pharaoh was smart. He put somebody out there. The reason we have a press secretary today is because they want somebody else out there giving the bad news, to take all the bad stuff. The good politicians always put somebody between them and the people. So the bitterness of this event is what really caused a lot of the things that we're going to see in Genesis 42, and how they became slaves because the Egyptian people overthrew the Semitic rulers, and things changed fairly quickly. But the bitterness of this is what causes everything going forward. So after Joseph died and the new pharaohs were in place and his family had prospered, the people of Egypt said, well, wait a minute, we got to take him out now. So that's what we'll find in chapter 42. Thank you so much for joining me. I noticed on YouTube there's 3,600 views. That is insane. Of course, by the time you see this, it'll probably be even higher, I hope. The goal is to get the word of God out. So please share, comment, send me feedback, let people know about this. And that way we can love God, love people, and change the world. God bless.